So this is part of my research for my book, which recently came out in 2021, published by Cornell University Press. And this is also this is an open access book. So that means there's a digital version which is free and accessible to the public. So if you go to the Cornell University Press page for this book, you'll find a link to open access, but you can also get it through a variety of online platforms as well. And so the cover is actually, this is an artwork by a German-American artist who painted a lot of what we call genre scenes, so a lot of scenes of daily life in the United States in the early 1800s. I kind of feel it's kind of fitting in some ways that like the painter himself is an immigrant, and he was really kind of interested in, and much of the book is kind of interested about what does it mean, what's the meaning of citizenship in daily life, and how do immigrants kind of affect citizenship, and what the rights are that go into citizenship, and the concepts of citizenship, and the meaning of citizenship. So yeah, so there's this very fitting image that I was able to find and use for the book, and it is set in Pennsylvania, right, rather than Ohio, which is our theme for today. But nonetheless, right, I like the image and kind of the various characters, right, standing around, kind of chatting, doing everyday things that the citizens of Philadelphia like to do in circa 1811 to 1813. So how did this particular chapter get its start? So I was really looking through a lot of archival items, and I was trying to find material about indentured servants. And so I came across this very strange notice. And so this was put out in the Marietta American Friend on December 7th, 1818. And so you can see the notice says caution. And it says, I do hereby caution and forewarn all persons in the state of Ohio and elsewhere from harboring or employing, aiding or assisting, or contracting with or trusting the following 22 German servants who indented themselves to me on the 30th day of October 1818 in the city of Philadelphia, to go to the Alabama territory and serve me 3 years and 5 months after their arrival, to wit. And then they're all individually named, right? So John Gould, Elizabeth Gould, his wife, right? All these various people, right? And Anna Maria Freitag, various kinds of amounts of anglicization of their names, which also means, right, among some of the challenges of doing research of German immigrants is that they often anglicize their names, and it makes it very hard to find them in records. So he lists all these people. He says, who has absconded from my service at Marietta, Washington County, state of Ohio, as they will be dealt with according to law, and that no contracts will be paid by me. Further, I forbid them or their children from becoming citizens of the United States. And this is the part that, when I saw it, I was like, oh, wait, okay, something really interesting is going on here. As they're not free until they go to the Alabama territory and serve me there 3 years and 5 months after their arrival, agreeably to their indenture. Okay, so first off, I want to give some historical context, right? So this was the thing that started me on this research journey. I want to distinguish indentured servitude from other forms of unfreedom that existed, especially right the distinction between indentured servitude and slavery. So one of the key aspects of indentured servitude is that it was temporary. So this was often to fund the cost of passage across the Atlantic Ocean. And so in return for paying the cost of passage, the servant agreed to work for a certain number of years, or a certain amount of time, which was usually several years. And so during that time, they would not receive wages, but obviously they received room and board from their employer. And they also received what were called freedom dues. So at the end of that term, they would, right, in the 1600s, they might receive land. By the early 1800s, they get 2 suits of clothing, which and clothing was pretty expensive at this time. And then also in this case, the tools of their trade as well, they would also receive. So these are also contracts that are written. So there's a contract that is written and recorded. And that contract can have certain stipulations, right? And some of that is negotiated at the time of the contract. So a lot of contracts in the early 1800s for children have a stipulation that there will be a certain amount of schooling that happens. And so, right, there's a certain amount of flexibility in terms of what's put in the contracts and what is usually kind of like the boilerplate amount. Another important aspect of these contracts is there's a specific subcategory of indentured servants who are known as redemptioners. And so they agree to indentured servitude to fund the cost of their passage, but if they arrive and there are family members, at their arrival, the family members can buy the contract and right allow them to have their freedom. And this is especially common for German immigrants. So right, a lot of the documents refer to them as redemptioners. So in addition, right, so first off, right, so this is all temporary. There's a contract that spells this out. So there's also additional protections from violence and abuse that are compared to slavery. And more broadly, right, indentured servants have a lot more access to courts, right? They're much more capable of bringing suits into courts and getting favorable results in the courts. And this is especially the case after the year 1800 for white servants. So there's a number of changes that happened in the 1770s into the 1800s. So this system of indenture comes under pressure, mostly rhetorical. And so slavery is abolished in the northern states after independence. And some of that happens more quickly in some states than others. But enslaved people have their enslavements converted into indentures. But like I said, they lack the protections that white servants have. And servants find competing opportunities for work. And one of the things that I really emphasize in this book is male servants emphasize their treatment as equals if they choose to remain in their positions. But there's other work options that these servants have, and that kind of affects sort of the power and control that their employers have as well. At the same time, once the contract ends, the former indentured servants are still economically precarious, and so they often still have to rely on the goodwill of masters for networks and contacts and kind of building their trades or their economic lives. So for the first three decades or so of the 1800s, 2.5 decades, 3.5 decades. The contracts are pretty. I mean, there's loopholes. There's ways that courts kind of give these contracts more scrutiny for European indentured servants, but they're still largely enforced until the mid 1830s, and that's when there's a shift to industrial wage labor. Okay, so so that's sort of the context here. So let's come to the story. So these redemptioners, right? They arrive in Philadelphia. And so when they come off the ship from their Atlantic journey, they negotiate labor contracts with the buyers of their time. So, right, they agree to work for a certain number of years, and as I stated before, and so they contract with this man James Brown. It's the same guy who took out the ad there. And once again, right, the challenges of research. James Brown is a very common name. So I can't definitively link him to a historical person, but I believe this is somebody who later became a U.S. Senator from Louisiana. And so, right, they contract with this James Brown, and so, right, we see that ad. There are also there's a book wherein all German indentures in Philadelphia are recorded, and the German immigrant community is kind of policing protections for them. So they sign the contracts. They leave Philadelphia November 2nd, and then so they travel overland through Pennsylvania and what was then Virginia, not yet West Virginia. So they arrive at Wheeling, and then they began this boat trip down the Ohio River, right? So that starts on November 26th. So this is kind of, over the course of about a month or so. And so they approach Marietta 3 days later on November 29th. Okay, so this is, right, the passage down the Ohio is treacherous. You need pilots to kind of look out for, the sandbar shift. This is probably what's known as a flatboat, so it's basically like a raft. And so the boat encounters difficulties, as often happens, but they're very close to Marietta, right? They're like a mile away from Marietta. So everyone leaves the boat and walks over to Marietta and gets to spend some time off the boat. But once they're there and the kind of the difficulties with the boat are resolved, the servants refuse to get back on the boat. And so James Brown talks to a lawyer, right? So he talks to his local lawyer, and he tries to get the townsfolk to assist him in forcing the servants back on board. And the inhabitants of Marietta are not interested in helping him. And so he comes back the next day, and the servants are in the middle of negotiating kind of their status with a prominent local citizen, Caleb Emerson. And so we have a variety of sort of statements and replies in the local newspaper is where these accounts are. And then James Brown ultimately took his case to Congress and petitioned the United States Congress for relief from what he viewed as an injustice to him. But in the meantime, certain men came with Mr. Brown from the Virginia side, armed with bludgeons, etc., in an attempt to coerce these servants. And so this is a legal process, right? So this doesn't sound very legal, but this is the doctrine of the posse comitatus. And this is sort of more fondly depicted in kind of the westerns. Gather the posse and let's go out and get those cattle rustlers or whatever it is, right? But historically, it's actually mainly used to, especially in kind of this borderland region, to reinforce the system of slavery and try and capture people trying to escape slavery. And so this is the model that James Brown seems to be using. But the crowd organizes against his posse and prevents him from being very effective in this instance. So there's the servants actually leave town for a little bit, and then their friends kind of say, okay, come on back, we're gonna work this out, it's gonna be okay. So there's a hearing that happens over several days, and so during this period, Brown is arrested and charged by one of his servants for assault and battery and false imprisonment. And so another Marietta citizen, David Putnam, stated that the money and the cost and the expenses of Brown's servants could be made up. And this is basically the bail was to fund the cost of freedom for the servants. And if Brown did not take that, he could whistle for them. And so here we see the negotiation, right? So Caleb Emerson says, okay, so this was the amount that Brown states that he paid for these contracts, $1,275. And this was proposed to him in Marietta to redeem these Germans, paying all reasonable charges, but he refused to take less than $3,500. All right, so Brown was trying to, in this account, drive this hard bargain for these people's freedom. But then this got into some legal questions that really kind of relate to kind of issues relating to slavery, freedom, and kind of the history of the Underground Railroad. So Congress would later pass a much more controversial fugitive slave law in 1851 that required bystanders to intervene, white bystanders to intervene in the support of slaveholders. But the earlier law, still allowed this process to happen, but there was no bystander requirement. So in this local court, this constitutional question, was debated. Did this law also apply to white indentured servants? And the local court said no. In the meantime, Brown continued to be held under arrest. So he was, in prison for several days. He petitioned for habeas corpus, right, so to produce the body, right, out of prison into the court, and was released on December 4th. And so he leaves town, and then but he also takes out the ad in the local paper. All right, so he's gone for a while, right? So he leaves in December. A couple months later, he's back. He had gone to a federal judge in Ohio and received a federal warrant. But also before going to Marietta, right, he stopped at Parkersburg to procure physical aid to assist in arresting his servants, and he was able to seize 6 of them. And when he got to Marietta, he found 2 of his servants in the employ of Caleb Emerson, who had been the zealous advocate for their emancipation. So right, Brown shows up. Emerson manages to kind of talk him out of it. He's like, it's Sunday, right? It's the Lord's Day. We're not going to do this business on the Sabbath. Emerson's from New England, so or from a New England family, which was sort of this is where this tradition existed, right, historically. And so Brown comes back, shortly after that, and he found the door closed, the family, I should say, not at home, and no news to be had. And so right previously, right, there was the posse that came over from Virginia to take these people back into servitude. And now we see the reverse, right, a bunch of people crossing from Marietta to the Virginia side to try and rescue the servants. But they were apparently not successful. So the next morning, Brown comes back to Emerson's house, and Caleb Emerson's wife says neither here nor the servants were there, right, and that he had left town. So Brown continues his search. He gets no help from the Marietans, and so he's looking outside of town because he heard that they left town, and they went up Duck Creek, and so he hears that the Redemptioners were not far off, and at this point, Sheriff Buell and Caleb Emerson had collected about several hundred men, right, had stopped in the woods nearby, gave a signal, they marched out of the woods, right, and the constable, right, arrested Brown. And then Brown finds that he's continually rearrested for the prosecution, and then the prosecution halts each time. And finally, Brown just kind of gives up and leaves town with 6 captured servants. And so Brown is on his way further south. He stops at Cincinnati. He's going down the Ohio River. And again, he finds a crowd, right? So he gets there, and there's this crowd, and witnesses have differ a little bit in some of the specifics of what happened. So the crowd, initially they didn't board the boat, but they compelled the disembarkation of the servants. And then a larger crowd showed up and forced the boat to land. And then the crowd took such things as they chose, stating them to be the property of the aforesaid German servants. So people came onto the boat, and a lot of them were also earlier. They picked up rocks on the side of the river and prepared to throw them at people too. Okay, so what's the significance of all of this? Right, this is unsuccessful, right? And this is partially why we hear a lot about this, right? So I want to emphasize the important role of crowds and community support. So when people are trying to negotiate their freedom, right, this is how kind of a direct version of public opinion is really important. And gaining the support of the community is important for being able to secure freedom. And so also competing ideas of citizenship and equality, right? Whether or not these people are allowed to become citizens, right, is one of the points of debate. At the same time, right, these crowds in Ohio feel that, right, these are people who are potential citizens, who are deserving of equality, right, who are deserving potential community members. But then, right, a lot of that story is pretty warm and fuzzy, right? But I also really want to contrast that with, okay, so white servants get this greater equality during this time, but African Americans do not. So the support that these German indentured servants got was not what people trying to escape slavery from Virginia and Kentucky would receive. And so, right, the most famous example of this is the case of Margaret Garner, who crossed into Cincinnati, but was recaptured and killed her daughter rather than allow her daughter to go back into slavery. And this is sort of made famous in Toni Morrison's novel Beloved. So this is right. So those are kind of the main claims that I'm trying to make here. And so I think this is a really interesting case. Right, so some other people have also written about this case as well. So there's also published by one of the librarians at Marietta College. She's also written on this as well. So yeah, I will stop there and room for questions.
Crowds, did they have an awareness that these indentured servants were coming to Cincinnati? I mean, they knew they were really taking a stand?
Yeah, it looks like we don't get clear evidence that there was direct communication. Like, hey, this happened in Marietta, and somebody brought the news to Cincinnati. But I suspect that probably is what happened, right? But I didn't want to make that direct claim without the evidence that it happened. But at the same time, it looks like there's a lot of kind of informal surveillance of what's going on, right? What are the new boats that are coming in? Who's on those boats, right? Everybody wants to know that stuff, right? It's the news, right? So there's a lot of, like, and the news travels in person, right? So you want to meet the people on the boats as fast as you can. And right, I kind of gave this abbreviated version, but actually what's happening is some people hear that German is being spoken on one of those boats. And then, so there's kind of this emerging German community. So actually speaking of anniversaries, this is the 200th anniversary of the founding of Cincinnati's Jewish community, right? So the Germans arrived like, a little bit before that. And then we see kind of the establishment of the Jewish community, Jewish burial ground, right? And growing Jewish community in Cincinnati. But yeah, so the German speakers in Cincinnati are like, oh, hey, right? Like, what's your deal? Where you're from? You're obviously from Germany, right? Like, tell us what's going on. And they kind of hear this. And so then there's this negotiation that kind of happens. And we get some slightly different accounts. So some of the witnesses say that they were like, oh, just let us talk to these people a little bit if you can get them off the boat. And then like they kind of string them out, right? So exactly how they're gotten off the boat is a little bit murky according to the evidence. But yeah, it looks like I'm guessing the news traveled, so they may have already been on the lookout. But it's also possible that they didn't know, but there's still kind of that people kind of waiting for the boats to come and kind of seeing what was going on meant that the community chose to act quickly. We associate this with kind of the American Revolution and the Stamp Act and but there's a longer history of crowds engaging in various kinds of action. So prices are too high. There needs to be a fair price for this, or other kinds of people engaging in enforcing community norms of one sort or another. And sometimes this is in cooperation with the law, sometimes it's in competition. And then there's also the tension between kind of the upper class of the community and ordinary people, and how do you, right? Because we often see the upper class people are leading the crowd. Yeah.
So when they looked inside the citizenship, the courts, were they state, federal courts that were?
So this is I'm off the top of my head, I think probably states, but it's like a local court.
Because I'm reading from your book, the layers that involve.
Yeah. So this is
citizenship.
Yeah.
Shape at the state local.
Yeah. So yeah, this is this question, right? Like, are you a citizen of your town? Are you a citizen of your state? Are you a citizen of the United States? And it looks like James Brown feels that national citizenship benefits him and his interests, whereas these people feel that this local version of citizenship is much more effective for them. And so yeah, so I'm kind of looking at those tensions that are operating, right?
Sure,
in this process
of right? The courts would play that role.
Yeah. And so right, these courts issue this ruling, right? But it's also in concert with what's going on with the crowd and what the crowd is doing. Yeah. So in fact, I cut this out a little bit for length, but when it's ruled that they're allowed to go free in the local court in Marietta, everybody cheers, right? And it's James Brown who's kind of doing this kind of like, and the crowd cheer, right? Like, I also like the source because it's, it kind of fits a little bit easily into kind of the villains and heroes, right? Like it's really easy to kind of tell a story about this, which is one of the challenges as historians. Like we realize like the power and the importance of stories. At the same time, we have to be like kind of careful about that, right? That it allows people to support certain kinds of evidence or think about things in certain ways. But if you can't fit that easily into a story, it's a lot harder to kind of make the case for that. So yeah. Oh, good. There's questions on Teams. Excellent.
Yeah. So the question is, were there indentured servants down south, or
yes.
was it just a northern thing? And were they treated differently?
So this is where we see a lot of there's a lot of variation over time. Is probably a good way to put this. But there's also distinctions of race are in some ways preserved. At the same time, there's certain kinds of labor that we see white servants will consent to, and other kinds of labor that they will not consent to. And so certain kinds of work is seen as white people's work, and other kinds of work is the work of enslaved people. And so there's often this negotiation that happens. And it looks like some of the food provisions are also not as good. So where possible, servants make it pretty clear that they want to avoid selling their labor in the southern states, because Philadelphia is kind of a major point where a lot of people come, and sometimes don't go to Virginia, right? It's what seems to be kind of the common knowledge when people are negotiating contracts. But in my research, I also found James Madison employed some German indentured servants. So I was just kind of, is it that James Madison? It is, yes, it is that James Madison, right? Yeah. So we do see this system persist. And there's actually another major destination for Germans at this time is Louisiana. And there's actually another famous court case where a woman is enslaved, and there were some German immigrants who recognized her as somebody who was on a ship with indentured servants, and that somehow, her indenture has been converted to enslavement, and so there's a case about her racial identity, and sort of once again kind of the legality of her status. And there's a lot of complicated and surprising and also very disturbing things about kind of the laws of race and slavery and indentured servitude versus slavery that we've learned over time.
Question is that we're told that there were free states up north and slavery states down south.
Yeah.
What was happening in the West at this time?
So this is another big point of this is part of the contention and the leading up to the Civil War. So a good example of that is I'll start with a good example and then with the really strange, confusing example. So in California, when the gold rush happens, people come from all over the world, right? So people come from Chile in South America, people come from France, people come from China, and naturally, right, since it's been taken by the United States from Mexico, a few years just before the gold rush. So there's Americans from the East who are coming in, and so there's a bunch of different ways in which people imagine how is the work of getting the gold going to be done. And so once again our kind of popular memory is these guys just kind of came on their own and they panned for gold and that was it, right? But what happens is in certain cases southern slave owners come and they force their slaves to harvest the gold, and they monitor and oversee this process. And so there's an intent to introduce and keep slavery in California. And so we often see attempts by slave owners will travel to northern states or western states And technically, right, these are people who should be free, according to the law, but slave owners work to try and keep them enslaved. And so this is right, the Dred Scott case in part is related to this. So what happens if somebody is, let's say, person is taken to Wisconsin territory, and then what is their status after that, right? And right, because the Supreme Court says all these terrible things, right? This also leads to pro-slavery things, right? That this leads to right those increasing tensions. So that's kind of a clearer understanding of this. The other thing is, so when under Spanish rule in New Mexico, there's a very complicated system that emerges that's kind of coerced labor, and officially slavery is banned in the Spanish Empire, but or enslavement, I should say, the indigenous people is banned, but in practice they tolerate it in New Mexico. And so when slavery is abolished, there's a lot of the U.S. Army is trying to kind of end slavery in New Mexico, and they find that it's kind of bound up with like a lot of complicated things relating to kind of community relations and kind of indigenous communities. And so there's a lot of complicated stuff that happens in Reconstruction or 1860s, 1870s New Mexico as the U.S. government is asserting its authority against indigenous people there. So yeah, hopefully that answers. Is that a question?
Yeah, there's another question. So this person is basically asking, did the government participate in hiring any indentured servants to build infrastructure? For example, they're giving the example of the Chinese building the railroads.
Yeah, so this actually creates, this is related to the end of effective indenture. So indenture contracts have these stipulations about housing and food and right, other kinds of care, rather than a free wage labor would just be like, here's your money, go rent your own house, right, buy your own food, right? That's not my problem. So it sort of kind of ends some of sort of the more intimate bonds between the employer and the employed. And so building the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal, the canal that runs along the Potomac River, there's basically, there's a brief recession in the British Isles, and so a lot of people get thrown out of work, and so a bunch of people come from England and Ireland and are hired to work on the canal, but then they get into these lawsuits that are, the conditions, I was made to, be in this house and the conditions were not good in the house, and, I was supposed to get a certain amount of clothing and this and that, and so there's all these lawsuits that stem from this, and that basically they're not effective, right? There's no way that they can effectively really enforce the contract because the servants are too litigious. And so, yeah.
There's another question about census during this time. Were indentured servants included in the census?
So we see changes over time. So by 1850, we get information about every person in the household, which is right, a lot of interest to historians and genealogists. What's really frustrating about the earlier censuses is that you only get the head of household, the peers, and that everyone else just is like a number, right? That is categorized, by race and gender. But yeah, it's one of the challenges of working with the early census is it's very hard to find people who aren't the head of household in records. So yeah, so we don't always see them that way. One thing that appears elsewhere in my book, so during the War of 1812, when the US goes to war with Great Britain, all British subjects are required to register with the federal government. And there's some attempts to do this before this, but this is like the first really successful one where we see lots and lots of records come in. And so a lot of states only report the head of household, but Massachusetts reports every single person who's in the household. So there's a lot of really great data from Massachusetts, and it kind of says what's the relation of the other people in the household. So sometimes it's a landlady and she has a boarding house, and there's some immigrants who live in the house but aren't related to her. In other cases we see servants included. Yeah, so this is Searching for these records can be very challenging, and it's very exciting for historians who are doing research if they come across something that's really comprehensive like that. That it allows us to answer all kinds of questions that we may have. Oh, and yes.
Was the census always federally derived, or was
so
how that originated?
So it is as a result of the Constitution, and so so part of the complaints in the colonies leading up to the Revolution is that the British Parliament was not the colonists were not represented in the Parliament, and then the British government said, well, we haven't done any reapportionment for over 100 years, or nearly 100 years at that point. And Manchester's a big city; they don't have a seat in Parliament, right? So what are you complaining about? And the colonists were like, well, Manchester should have a seat, right? And Manchester actually lost its seat because there were too many Puritans, right, and not enough people in the Church of England. But so the federal census goes along with the Constitution. Off the top of my head, I know there's colonial records that sometimes we see things that said like tax inventories and stuff like this. So I know that there's research about this, right, and there's knowledge by other historians, but kind of off the top of my head, I can go, oh yeah, Virginia census of 1762 says right. These are often hard records to work with.
You mentioned something about the litigious nature of the indentured servant.
Mm-hmm.
They acquire this legal defense.
So this is really interesting. What we see is so we see often initially, right, they're not they're using their older model of what it's like to be a servant in Europe as kind of their expectations about where they might or might not have court access, things that they can legitimately complain about, things that are not permitted. So in the 1700s and early 1800s, in Germany, right, it is permitted for masters to violently correct their servants, right? So to beat their servants, that's permitted. But this, right, the servants pretty quickly learn, right, like they come to the US and they're like, this is not acceptable for white servants. And so it looks like there's a lot of they become much more acquainted with the customs of the region and then kind of the social meaning of their status. And so they become a lot more assertive. When he got here, right, now he's Bill, but he took his employer to court and he was able to get the indenture ended because there was a typographical error in the servant document, right? So we see the courts apply more scrutiny and the courts are more open to the indentured servants. And they take advantage of that, and they, they're aware. They learn pretty quickly about the legal environment. And in the final chapter, and this is actually one of the things that I say is, right, sometimes when they're doing this, they're also not doing it necessarily as citizens, but they're people with legal rights in America, right? So there's somebody who says to a master, "This is America." And I am now your equal, right? And actually, this is a matter of custom, right? So, do the servants dine with the master? Are meals had with the master? And the servants are often like, oh, I set the table, and look, oh, here's the spot, right, for me, right here, right? And this is often a point of contention between employers and servants. And I also use an English. An Englishwoman's memoir as well, where she's in Cincinnati, and one of her servants is like, "Oh, I love your dress. I want to borrow it." And so this Englishwoman, she's like, "No." So this is kind of what's kind of considered acceptable and what's not acceptable is negotiated, and kind of see this going on with kind of like different norms. And actually, so when this Englishwoman comes to, she goes on a trip to Canada, and she's so happy because she's like, everybody curtsies when I go by in her carriage, and that these people are happy that they're not citizens, that they're royal subjects of His Majesty. I'm paraphrasing a little But yeah, she's definitely like, they are subjects and they're not citizens, and right, the boys bow and the girls curtsy because they know, manners, right? Yeah, we see a lot of, there's a German aristocrat who comes and visits and kind of leaves his account, and he's like, everyone is so coarse and vulgar here. Kind of see him with his high starched collar, just, can't countenance what is around here, right? So yeah, it's some very different expectations about what's happening and kind of what's kind of negotiated within the household is very interesting. Yeah. Are there additional questions?
Someone said that they may have missed it, but where can they purchase your book?
So you can buy it through online booksellers like Amazon, and you can. Right, this is an official OU event, so I try not to promote a particular online. There are many other online booksellers which you should also consider, but if you Google stranger citizens, you'll see, right, you can see what comes up and choose your preferred method, and the open access copies are free. So if many online booksellers will show kind of the hard copy is $19.95 or similar, and then the digital open access copy is free. So yes, so Google it, and if you type in stranger citizens and open access, you will probably find many ways to obtain a copy of the book in hardback or in digital open access form. I very much appreciate that question, though. I mean, I appreciated all the questions thus far, but that was an excellent question. Yeah. Well, I think we have. I'm not too sure how we are for time, but 2:30. Okay, so we're pretty much right on the dot, right? It turns out this is a very well planned lecture time-wise. So, well, I thank everyone for coming in person or via Teams. This is a really great discussion, and I hope it was a great informative experience for everyone. So,
Thank you, John.
Yeah, thanks.